Dawn breaks over the East China Sea on April 6, 1945. A young sailor named Thomas McKinley stands at his battle station aboard USS Bush, a Fletcher-class destroyer positioned 16 miles north of Okinawa's main invasion fleet. His hands rest on the controls of a 5-inch gun mount, and though he doesn't know it yet, the shells loaded in that gun contain technology that will change naval warfare forever. In 6 hours, McKinley will fire more rounds than he did in the previous 2 years of war combined. In 8 hours, his ship will be sinking, but in those desperate minutes between survival and destruction, he will witness something that Japanese commanders thought impossible: electronic intelligence defeating human sacrifice at a scale that would break the back of the Kamikaze offensive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning starts quietly, almost peacefully. McKinley has been awake since 0400 hours, running through the same pre-battle checks he's performed dozens of times before. But today feels different. The intelligence briefings last night were unusually detailed. Operation Kikusui, Number 1, they called it. Floating chrysanthemum. The name sounded beautiful, almost poetic, until the intelligence officer explained what it meant. 300 Japanese aircraft, all committed to suicide attacks, all launching simultaneously against the radar picket line where Bush now patrolled. McKinley remembers the silence in the briefing room after those numbers were announced. 300 aircraft, not bombing runs where pilots might turn back, not reconnaissance missions. 300 pilots who had already written their final letters home, who had drunk their ceremonial sake, who were coming with one intention: to die while taking American ships with them. But something else was mentioned in that briefing, something that made the captain's voice carry a note of confidence McKinley hadn't heard before: the ammunition. 75% of their 5-inch shells were now equipped with VT fuses. Variable time fuses, though everyone knew what the VT really stood for: proximity. Smart shells, some sailors called them. Electronic shells, shells that knew when to explode without being told. McKinley didn't fully understand the technology, something about radio waves and miniature tubes that survived being fired from a gun, but he understood the numbers. The new fuses were 3 times more effective than the old mechanical timers. 3 times. In a battle where seconds determined survival, that difference was everything. The sun climbs higher, painting the ocean in shades of gold and blue that seem impossibly serene for what's coming. McKinley thinks about the Japanese pilots preparing for launch right now, probably no more than 100 miles away. He tries to imagine what they're feeling. Fear, certainly, but also pride, duty, perhaps even relief that their sacrifice would have meaning. Japanese culture revered such dedication. The samurai tradition of honorable death, the concept of Bushido. These pilots believed they were upholding centuries of warrior heritage, that their deaths would protect their homeland and families. McKinley respects that courage, even as he prepares to kill as many of them as possible. War didn't allow for the luxury of understanding your enemy's nobility. It only demanded that you survive. At 0530 hours, the radar operators in Bush's Combat Information Center detect the first contacts. Not a handful of aircraft, not a dozen. The radar scope shows what looks like a solid mass, dozens of individual returns merging into waves that stretch across the northern horizon. The general quarters alarm shatters the morning calm, and McKinley feels his heart rate spike as he's already at his station when the faith call comes. His loader, a kid from Iowa named Danny Chen, crosses himself quickly and whispers something McKinley can't hear over the alarm. They both know what those radar contacts mean. In less than 30 minutes, the sky will be full of aircraft that want nothing more than to crash into their ship. The 5-inch mount rotates smoothly as McKinley tracks the bearing being called out from the Combat Information Center. Bearing 345, range 12,000 yards and closing. He can't see the aircraft yet, they're still beyond visual range, but the fire control system is already computing intercept solutions. This is where the VT fuses prove their first advantage. With the old mechanical time fuses, The fire control team would need to estimate the exact range to target, calculate the flight time of the shell, set the fuse to detonate at a specific moment, and hope their math was correct. A single error in estimation, a miscalculation of wind speed, a change in the targets at altitude, and the shell would explode harmlessly in empty sky. But the VT fuses eliminate all that uncertainty. The shell will know when it's close enough to kill. It will decide for itself when to detonate. For the first time in history, the ammunition is smarter than the gunner needs to be. At 0600 hours exactly, McKinley sees them. Dark specks against the brightening sky, so many that they look like a swarm of insects. 0 fighters in the lead, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at distance. Behind them, larger shapes. Yokosuka dive bombers, old training aircraft pressed into suicide service, even some twin-engine Betty bombers that intelligence says carry the Oka flying bombs. McKinley has seen photographs of the Oka, a piloted missile with 3 rocket motors and a 1,200-kilogram warhead. Baka, the Americans call it, fool, because any pilot who climbs into that coffin is already dead. He just doesn't know exactly when yet. The first 5-inch gun on Bush opens fire at 11,000 yards, far beyond the range where conventional ammunition would be effective. The shell screams out of the barrel at 2,600 feet per second, spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute, and inside its nose, a miniature radio transmitter activates. The transmitter sends out continuous radio waves in a narrow cone ahead of the shell. As the shell arcs through the sky toward the approaching formation, those radio waves bounce off the aircraft and return to the shell's receiver. The electronic brain inside the fuse, no larger than a pint bottle but containing 130 individual components, measures the Doppler shift in the returning signal. When the frequency indicates the shell is within 70 feet of an aircraft, the fuse triggers the detonation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. McKinley doesn't see the shell impact. He's already loading the next round. But he sees the result. A black puff of smoke in the sky and one of the dark specks tumbling out of formation, trailing fire. No direct hit required. The shell passed close enough, and the VT fuse did exactly what it was designed to do. 70 feet might sound like a miss, but when a 5-inch shell detonates, it throws steel fragments in every direction with enough force to shred aluminum aircraft skin and destroy engines, control surfaces, and pilots. That first kill happens at a range where mechanical time fuses would have been guesswork. The proximity fuse made it a certainty. The Japanese formation doesn't scatter. That's what strikes McKinley as most terrifying about kamikaze attacks. Normal pilots would break off, would evade, would try to preserve their lives for another mission. But these pilots keep coming, straight and level, accepting the losses as inevitable. They've been trained to accept death. Their entire tactical doctrine is built around the assumption that enough of them will get through to make the sacrifice worthwhile. What they haven't been trained for, what their commanders haven't anticipated, is the wall of electronically fused explosions that Bush and the other Pickett destroyers are now creating. Every 5 seconds, McKinley's gun fires another round. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. The rhythm becomes automatic, mechanical, and around him the other gun mounts are doing the same. The mathematical superiority of the VT fuse becomes apparent immediately. Against kamikaze aircraft approaching in formation, each proximity-fused shell has a kill radius 7 times larger than a time-fused shell. 7 times. That's not incremental improvement. That's revolutionary advantage. A formation that might have required 50 time-fused shells to break up can be shattered with 15 VT rounds. And Bush is firing all of its 5-inch guns simultaneously. The black puffs of VT, detonations fill the sky between the destroyer and the approaching Japanese formation. Each puff represents a sphere of steel fragments expanding at supersonic speed, any one of which could tear through an aircraft. The Japanese pilots are flying into a killing field that their training never prepared them for. They were taught that American anti-aircraft fire required precise aim. that high-speed approaches at wave-top height would minimize exposure, that the final seconds of the dive would be too fast for defenders to track. All of those assumptions were based on mechanical time fuses that had to be set before firing. The proximity fuse has invalidated every one of those tactical calculations. McKinley sees a Zero fighter pass through one of the VT detonation zones. The aircraft doesn't explode dramatically, it simply disintegrates. One moment it's a functional warplane carrying a determined pilot and a 250-kilogram bomb. The next moment it's tumbling wreckage, the pilot already dead, the bomb falling uselessly into the sea. That's the psychological genius of the proximity fuse. It doesn't just destroy aircraft, it destroys hope. Japanese pilots approaching American task forces are watching their squadron mates simply cease to exist at ranges they thought were safe. The Americans aren't getting lucky shots. They're achieving consistent kills with mathematical precision. By 0615, Bush has fired 87 VT-fused 5-inch rounds and destroyed 11 aircraft. 11 confirmed kills in 15 minutes. The mathematical efficiency is staggering. With old time-fused ammunition, those 11 kills would have required over 12,000 rounds, more ammunition than Bush carries in her entire magazine. With VT fuzzes, they're achieved with less than 100 shots. The difference isn't just tactical, it's the difference between survival and destruction. A destroyer that can kill 11 aircraft in 15 minutes can defend itself. A destroyer that needs 12,000 rounds for the same result would be overwhelmed in the first attack. But the Japanese keep coming. That's the terrible arithmetic of suicide warfare. They knew they would take losses. They accepted that most of them would die before reaching targets. The question was never whether individual pilots would survive. The question was whether enough aircraft could get through to sink enough ships to make the campaign unbearable for the Americans. And as McKinley watches the radar scope over the shoulder of a damage control officer who's come to his station, he sees that plenty of aircraft are still inbound. Bush and the other picket destroyers have destroyed dozens of Kamikaze, but dozens more are still coming. At 0642, McKinley sees his first Oka. The Betty bomber carrying it is already damaged, trailing smoke from one engine, but it's close enough now to release its deadly cargo. The Oka drops away from the bomber, and for a moment it glides, a small silver shape against the blue sky. Then the rocket motors ignite. McKinley has never seen anything accelerate so fast. The Oka goes from gliding to hypersonic in seconds, its 3 solid-fuel rockets pushing it to nearly 600 miles per hour. At that speed, even a proximity fuse might not react fast enough. The Oka is designed to be unstoppable in its final dive. But the proximity fuse has one more advantage the Japanese didn't anticipate. The VT shells don't need to track the Oka directly, they just need to create a barrier of detonations that the flying bomb has to pass through. 3 5-inch guns on Bush rotate to the Oka's bearing and fire in rapid succession. Not aimed shots trying to hit a target moving at 600 miles per hour. Pattern fire, creating overlapping spheres of fragments that form an invisible wall. The first shell detonates ahead of the Oka, the second detonates above it. The third detonates close enough that the fragments shred. The Oka's control surfaces. The flying bomb goes ballistic, tumbling out of control, the pilot inside already dead from the violent rotation. It impacts the sea 300 yards from Bush, and the 1,200-kilogram warhead detonates on impact, sending up a column of water that drenches the ship's forward deck. McKinley realizes he's been holding his breath. That Oka would have hit them. Without the VT fuses, without the ability to create that fragment barrier, the flying bomb would have struck Bush amidships and probably broken the destroyer in half. Instead, it's a spectacular miss, and the ship is still fighting. That's when McKinley understands the true genius of the proximity fuse. It's not just about shooting down more aircraft, it's about shooting down the right aircraft at the right moment. The Oka was the greatest threat. The VT fuses killed it when time fuses would have been helpless. By 0700 hours, Bush has been in continuous combat for 60 minutes. McKinley's arms ache from loading shells, and his ears are ringing despite the sound protection. Around him, the gun crew operates with mechanical efficiency born of training and adrenaline. They don't talk, there's nothing to say. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. The rhythm is everything. Every shell fired is one more chance to kill a kamikaze before it reaches the ship. Every second of delay is one more chance for a Japanese pilot to complete his suicide mission. The radar scope shows that the first wave is finally thinning. 47 aircraft were tracked inbound toward Bush's sector. The proximity-fused 5-inch fire destroyed 23 of them outright. Combat air patrol fighters, guided by the destroyer's radar, accounted for 15 more. 9 aircraft broke through to attack range. 9 out of 47. That's an 8% success rate for the Japanese. They planned this operation, assuming at least a 30% success rate based on previous kamikaze campaigns in the Philippines. The difference is the VT Fuze. 23 kills with proximity-fused ammunition that would have been impossible with time fuses. Those 23 prevented hits represent the difference between manageable damage and catastrophic loss. But 9 aircraft still broke through, and 9 kamikaze pilots determined to die can do terrible damage. McKinley's gun mount rotates to track a Zero fighter coming in low, just above the wave tops, the classic kamikaze approach that minimizes radar detection time. The pilot is good, jinxing left and right, making himself a difficult target. McKinley fires 3 rounds in quick succession. The first detonates ahead of the Zero. The second detonates behind it. The third, guided by its own electronic intelligence, detonates exactly when it passes within 70 feet of the aircraft. The Zero's engine simply stops. No fire, no explosion, just sudden mechanical death as fragments destroy the cylinders and fuel lines. The aircraft noses over and impacts the sea 50 yards from Bush's port side. The pilot never had a chance to react. The proximity fuse killed his aircraft faster than human reflexes could process. 8 kamikaze left, then 7, as another gun mount scores a kill. Then 6, 5. But the last 5 are close now, close enough that McKinley can see the red circles on their wings, can almost make out the faces of the pilots in their cockpits. These are the ones who made it through everything. The combat air patrol, the long-range 5-inch fire, the medium-range 40mm guns. These are the determined survivors, the lucky ones, the pilots whose aircraft weren't in the wrong place when a VT shell detonated nearby, and they're seconds away from hitting the ship. McKinley watches the closest Zero fighter drop even lower, its propeller almost touching the wave tops. The pilot knows what he's doing. At this altitude, Bush's 5-inch guns can't depress low enough to track him. The 40mm Bofors guns are traversing, their crews frantically trying to acquire the target, but the kamikaze is coming in at a 45-degree angle that makes deflection shooting nearly impossible. McKinley feels a moment of pure helplessness. All the technological superiority in the world, all the proximity fuses and radar systems and fire control computers, and this young Japanese pilot with perhaps 100 hours of flight time has found the one angle of approach that negates it all. The Zero is 300 yards away when the 20mm Oerlikon gunner on Bush's port side opens fire. The Oerlikon is the last line of defense, a manually aimed weapon that depends entirely on the gunner's skill and courage. The gunner, a sailor from Tennessee named James Robert Harris, has been at his station for over an hour, watching aircraft explode at distances where his weapon is useless, waiting for this exact moment. The tracers reach out toward the Zero in a stream of light, and Harris walks his fire into the approaching aircraft with the patience of a man who has done this before. The 20mm rounds punch through the Zero's engine, cowling, into the fuel tanks, and suddenly the aircraft is a flying torch. But it's still flying, still coming. The pilot is either dead or beyond caring, and the Zero is going to hit Bush even if it arrives as nothing but flaming wreckage. The impact comes at 07:13 hours, port side amidships, just aft of the number 2 smokestack. The Zero's 250-kilogram bomb detonates on contact, blowing a hole in Bush's side large enough to drive a truck through. The explosion kills 11 men instantly, wounds 23 others, and starts fires that will burn for the next hour. McKinley is thrown against his gun mount by the blast, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. When he pulls himself up, he sees smoke pouring from the wound in his ship's side, and for the first time since the battle began, he thinks they might actually sink. But Bush doesn't sink, not yet. Damage control parties are already responding, rigging hoses, establishing fire boundaries, shoring up bulkheads. The destroyer was built to take punishment, and the crew has trained for this exact scenario dozens of times. The fires are contained within 10 minutes. The flooding is stopped by sealing compartments, and most critically, the 5-inch guns are still operational. McKinley's mount never stopped working. Even with his ship damaged and burning, even with men dying below decks, his job remains exactly the same. Load, aim, fire. Keep killing Kamikaze before they kill us. The second wave hits at 07:45. The radar operators, still functioning despite smoke filling the Combat Information Center, count 36 aircraft inbound. Bush is no longer pristine. She's wounded, slowed, trailing smoke that marks her position for every Japanese pilot in the sky. She's a wounded animal, and the Kamikaze are circling for the kill. McKinley knows this. Every man on the ship knows this. But knowing doesn't change anything. They're still going to fight. They're still going to make the Japanese pay for every yard of ocean, every second of time, every inch of Bush's hull. This time, the Kamikaze tactics have evolved. The Japanese pilots have learned from the first wave. Instead of approaching in tight formations that allow proximity-fused shells to kill multiple aircraft with single detonations, they're spreading out, coming from different directions simultaneously. It's a more sophisticated attack, one that requires Bush's guns to engage multiple targets at once instead of concentrating fire on dense formations. The tactical adaptation is impressive. The Japanese military might be losing the war, might be outmatched in technology and resources, but they're still learning, still evolving, still dangerous. McKinley's gun mount engages a Naval dive bomber approaching from the starboard quarter. Load, aim, fire. The VT-fused shell detonates 70 feet from the Naval's wing, and the aircraft tumbles out of the sky trailing smoke. That's kill number 29 for Bush today, but there's no time to celebrate. Another aircraft is already inbound from a different vector, then another, then another. The radar operators are calling out bearings so fast that McKinley can barely keep track. The tactical situation is deteriorating. Too many targets, too many directions, not enough time to engage them all. At 07:52, a Zero fighter breaks through the defensive fire and crashes into Bush's forward 5-inch mount. The explosion kills the entire gun crew instantly and destroys the mount's fire control system. That's 8 men gone in a flash of fire and metal. 8 men who were doing the same job McKinley is doing, loading and firing and trying to keep their ship alive. McKinley feels the blast, sees the fireball, and knows that could have been his mount. Random chance, the chaos of combat, the simple luck of which gun mount the Kamikaze pilot chose to target. There's no logic to it, no fairness, just the brutal reality that some men live and some men die, and the only thing that matters is keeping the ship fighting. The third hit comes at 08:07. Another zero, this one approaching from directly ahead, right down Bush's center line where overlapping fields of fire should have made survival impossible. But the pilot is either incredibly skilled or incredibly lucky, threading through the defensive fire with suicidal determination. The Zero crashes into the base of the forward smokestack, and this time the damage is critical. The explosion ruptures steam lines, kills another 12 men, and knocks out electrical power to half the ship. Bush's speed drops to 15 knots, then 10, then 5. The destroyer is dying. McKinley's gun mount is still operating on local control, meaning he can still aim and fire even without centralized fire control computers. But the ammunition supply is dwindling. They've fired over 300 VT-fused 5-inch shells this morning, and the magazines are running low. The loader, Danny Chen, climbs down to check the remaining ammunition and returns with news that McKinley already suspected. They have perhaps 50 rounds left. 50 rounds to survive, however many more Kamikaze are coming. The mathematics of survival have shifted dramatically, but those 50 rounds are still proximity fused. Even diminished and wounded, Bush still has the technological advantage. Each remaining shell is still 3 times more effective than old-time fused ammunition would be. 50 VT rounds equal 150 conventional rounds in terms of killing power. It's not enough to guarantee survival, but it's enough to keep fighting, and fighting is all they have left. The fourth wave appears at 0830. Radar is partially functional, giving intermittent returns that suggest at least 20 aircraft inbound. 20 aircraft against a crippled destroyer with 50 rounds of ammunition remaining and half its guns destroyed. The mathematics are brutal and clear. McKinley does not need a fire control computer to calculate their chances. They're going to die. The question is only how many kamikaze they can kill before Bush goes down. McKinley's gun mount engages a Judy dive bomber at 8,000 yards. The VT shell detonates close enough to shred the bomber's tail section, and the aircraft noses over into the sea. 49 rounds left, another Val approaching from port. Load, aim, fire. The proximity fuse does its job perfectly, detonating within 70 feet and destroying the Val's engine. 48 rounds left, a 0 from starboard, 47 rounds. A kamikaze that McKinley can't even identify, just a dark shape against the smoke and clouds. 46 rounds. The loading rhythm has changed. Danny Chen is moving slower now, the physical exhaustion of 2 hours of continuous combat finally catching up with him. McKinley's own arms feel like lead. Every shell weighs 54 pounds, and they've loaded hundreds of them this morning. But they keep loading, keep firing, because stopping means dying. The gun crews on every surviving mount are feeling the same exhaustion, pushing through the same physical limits, driven by the same desperate mathematics. Every shell fired is one more chance to live. At 0849, something remarkable happens. The Japanese attack falters, not because they've run out of aircraft. McKinley can still see dark shapes circling in the distance, but because Bush has killed so many of them that the survivors are breaking off. The proximity-fused fire has been so devastating, so consistent, so mathematically lethal, that even kamikaze pilots, men who have accepted death and volunteered for suicide missions, are choosing to withdraw rather than fly into that electronic killing field. It's a psychological victory more significant than any tactical calculation. The technology has defeated not just the aircraft but the will to attack. Bush has survived, barely. The destroyer is crippled, burning in 3 places, down to 5 knots with a 15-degree list to port. 94 men are dead or wounded. 3 of the 5 5-inch mounts are destroyed, but the ship is still afloat, still under power, and most critically, still capable of fighting if more kamikaze appear. The crew has fired 372 VT-fused 5-inch rounds and achieved 43 confirmed kills. 43 kamikaze aircraft destroyed by one destroyer's guns. With old-time fused ammunition, those same 43 kills would have required over 40,000 rounds, more ammunition than a dozen destroyers carry combined. The tug arrives at 0915 to take Bush under tow. McKinley finally allows himself to slump against his gun mount, his muscles trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Around him, the surviving gun crew members are doing the same, too tired to speak, too overwhelmed to process what they've just survived. Danny Chen is crying quietly, whether from relief or grief or simple exhaustion. McKinley doesn't know. He puts a hand on the younger man's shoulder and says nothing, because there's nothing to say that would make any difference. As Bush is slowly towed toward the anchorage, McKinley watches the other picket destroyers still on station. They're all damaged to varying degrees. Some are burning. One, he can't tell which from this distance, is clearly sinking. But they're all still fighting. Every destroyer on the radar picket line has been through the same desperate battle Bush just survived, and every one of them is still engaging kamikaze with proximity-fused ammunition. The mathematical superiority of the VT fuse has been proven in the most extreme test imaginable. 43 kills for one destroyer. Multiply that across a dozen picket destroyers, and the numbers become staggering. Hundreds of kamikaze aircraft destroyed before reaching the main fleet. Hundreds of Japanese pilots who volunteered to die but achieved nothing except their own deaths. Later, after the battle, after the casualties are counted and the damage assessed, after the survivors are transferred and Bush is written off as too damaged to repair, McKinley will learn the full scope of what happened on April 6, 1945. Operation Kikasui. Number 1 launched 355 kamikaze aircraft against the Okinawa invasion fleet. American forces, equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, destroyed 217 of them, 61%, better than 1 in 2. The success rate the Japanese commanders had predicted based on Philippines' campaign experience was 34%. They achieved less than half that at Okinawa. The difference was the VT Fuze. McKinley will also learn about USS Laffey, another destroyer, and on the picket line that survived 22 kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes. Laffey's gunners fired 345 VT-fused 5-inch rounds and destroyed 9 aircraft before 6 kamikaze broke through and hit the ship. But Laffey survived. With old ammunition, the 9 kills would have required over 10,000 rounds, and the ship would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes. The proximity fuse gave Laffey the killing power to survive the unsurvivable. He'll learn about the mathematical analysis performed by Navy operations research teams, calculations that proved VT ammunition required an average of 310 rounds per kill, compared to 1,162 rounds for time-fused shells. That 73% reduction in ammunition expenditure translated directly to increased survival rates for ships under kamikaze attack. The statistics were bloodless, clinical, precise, but behind every statistic was a destroyer crew that lived. Instead of dying, a group of men like McKinley who got to go home because electronic intelligence defeated human sacrifice. The proximity fuse had transformed the mathematical equation of kamikaze warfare. The Japanese had calculated that trading 1 pilot and 1 aircraft for 1 ship was favorable. Even accounting for defensive fire, if 30% of kamikaze reached their targets, the exchange ratio justified the losses. But the VT fuse changed everything. When 61% of kamikaze were destroyed before reaching attack range, when ships could fire 3 times as effectively with the same number of gun crews, the exchange ratio collapsed. The kamikaze became unfavorable not just tactically but strategically, economically, psychologically. McKinley thinks about the Japanese pilots he killed today. 43 aircraft, 43 men who woke up this morning knowing they would die before sunset. Young men, probably his age, probably with families and dreams and fears, just like his own. Men who believed their sacrifice would protect their homeland, would honor their ancestors, would mean something in the vast calculation of war, and their deaths meant nothing. Not because they lacked courage, they had flown into certain death with determination that McKinley could only imagine. But because technology had rendered their sacrifice obsolete, the proximity fuse had defeated the divine wind not with greater courage or determination, but with better engineering. The irony is profound. Japan had embraced kamikaze tactics because they lacked the industrial capacity to match American aircraft production, pilot training, and technological development. The suicide attacks were supposed to be the equalizer, the one tactic that turned numerical and technological inferiority into advantage by trading what Japan still had in abundance, young men willing to die, for what America couldn't easily replace, warships and trained sailors. But America's industrial capacity had produced the very technology that defeated that strategy. 22 million proximity fuses manufactured in 3 years. An industrial achievement that Japan, with its factories bombed and resources exhausted, could never have matched. As the tug slowly pulls Bush toward the anchorage, McKinley sees the massive American fleet anchored off Okinawa. Hundreds of ships, from destroyers to battleships to aircraft carriers to transport vessels, the invasion fleet that the kamikaze were supposed to decimate, supposed to make retreat, supposed to prove that American will could be broken by Japanese determination. The fleet is damaged, certainly. Several ships are clearly hit, trailing smoke, listing, being tended by repair vessels. But the fleet is still here, still functional, still overwhelming. The Kamikaze have failed to achieve their strategic objective, and the proximity fuse is the primary reason why. McKinley will carry the memory of this battle for the rest of his life. The sound of 5-inch guns firing continuously for 2 hours. The sight of kamikaze aircraft disintegrating in mid-air when VT shells detonated nearby. The feeling of his ship shuddering under impact. The knowledge that men were dying below decks while he kept loading and firing. The exhaustion, the fear, the desperate mathematics of survival, measured in remaining shells and inbound aircraft. But most of all, he'll remember the proof that technology could defeat even the most determined human sacrifice. That engineering and industry and scientific knowledge could produce devices that saved lives by taking them more efficiently. The proximity fuse represented more than just improved ammunition. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought. The miniaturization of electronics, the mass production of sophisticated technology, the integration of scientific knowledge into military hardware. These principles would dominate warfare for the next 80 years. The smart bombs, cruise missiles, electronic warfare systems, all descendants of the same concept, weapons that could think for themselves, that could make targeting decisions faster and more accurately than human operators. The VT fuse was the first, the prototype, the proof of concept that would reshape military technology forever. Bush finally reaches the anchorage at 1100 hours, 5 hours after the battle began. McKinley climbs down from his gun mount, his legs barely supporting him, and looks at the ship he's called home for 18 months. She's a wreck, burned, holed, listing, leaving an oil slick in her wake. But she's afloat. Her crew survived. And scattered across the ocean floor between here and the radar picket station are 43 kamikaze aircraft that never completed their missions because proximity-fused shells killed them first. That's the only victory that matters. Not glory, not honor, not even the strategic implications of technological superiority. Just survival. The simple, brutal fact that McKinley and most of his crewmates are still alive because American industry built better fuses than Japanese determination could overcome. The weeks following April 6th reveal the true scope of what the proximity fuse accomplished at Okinawa. While Bush limps back to Pearl Harbor for repairs she'll never receive, the decision is made to scrap her instead. The kamikaze offensive continues with 9 more major Kikusui operations. Each one launches hundreds of suicide aircraft against the American fleet. Each one is met with the same devastating proximity-fused defensive fire that shattered the first attack. The Japanese keep coming because their strategic calculus leaves no alternative, and the Americans keep killing them with mathematical precision because the VT fuse gives them no choice but to succeed. Lieutenant James Armstrong, a Navy operations analyst attached to Admiral Turner's staff, has the grim job of tabulating the results. His office aboard the command ship El Dorado is filled with reports from every destroyer, cruiser, and battleship in the fleet. Ammunition expenditure logs, aircraft kill confirmations, damage assessments, casualty reports. Armstrong's background is in mathematics. He taught at MIT before the war, and the numbers tell a story that's both triumphant and horrifying. Over the course of the Okinawa campaign, American ships will fire approximately 150,000 proximity-fused 5-inch shells. Those shells will account for the destruction of over 1,000 kamikaze aircraft, 1,000 young Japanese pilots who volunteered to die but were killed before their sacrifice could achieve its purpose. Armstrong calculates the alternative scenario. What would have happened if American forces had only time-fused ammunition? With the established ratio of 1,162 rounds per kill, destroying 1,000 kamikaze would have required over 1,160,000 shells. The entire Pacific Fleet didn't carry that much ammunition. The conclusion is inescapable. Without proximity fuses, the Okinawa invasion would have failed, not because of Japanese superiority, but because American ships would have literally run out of ammunition before the kamikaze offensive exhausted itself. The fleet would have been forced to withdraw, the invasion would have been postponed, and the strategic timeline for ending the war would have been fundamentally altered. But the VT Fuze didn't just prevent American defeat. It inflicted a psychological wound on Japanese forces that tactical victories never could. Armstrong interviews survivors from kamikaze units who aborted their missions, something that should have been impossible for men who had already accepted death. Their testimonies are remarkably consistent. The American defensive fire was impossibly accurate. Shells exploded exactly where aircraft were flying, not where they had been or where they were going to be, but where they were. The black puffs of VT detonations seemed to track aircraft with uncanny precision, as if the Americans could see the future. Several pilots used the same phrase, invisible hands guiding the shells. The psychological impact of facing weapons that seemed almost supernatural was breaking even the most dedicated kamikaze volunteers. One particular testimony stands out to Armstrong. A young pilot named Ensign Takeshi Yamamoto had been part of the April 16th Kikusui operation. His Zero fighter was one of 65 kamikaze launched that day against the northern radar picket line. Yamamoto's testimony, given after he crash-landed his damaged aircraft and was captured, describes flying through what he calls a wall of explosions. He counted 9 aircraft from his formation destroyed before they reached attack range, 9 out of 20 in his group. The explosions weren't random. They occurred with precise timing, as if the shells knew exactly when to detonate. When his own aircraft was damaged by fragments from a near miss, Yamamoto made the decision that should have been impossible for a kamikaze pilot. He turned back. The shame of that decision, he tells his interrogators, is less than the certainty that his death would accomplish nothing against defensive fire that accurate. Armstrong's analysis includes interviews with American gun crews from ships across the fleet. Their perspective provides the other side of the technological equation. Gunner's mate First-class Robert Chen, no relation to Danny Chen from Bush, serves aboard the destroyer Laffey, the ship that survived 22 kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes. Chen's testimony is clinical, almost detached, as if discussing a training exercise rather than desperate combat. The VT fuses eliminated the guesswork, he explains. With time-fused ammunition, every shot required estimation, calculation, prediction. You aimed where you thought the aircraft would be when the shell reached altitude, set the fuse timer accordingly, and hoped your mathematics were correct. Margin for error was enormous. Wind speed, aircraft velocity changes, altitude variations, any miscalculation meant a wasted shell. But VT fuses required only one calculation. Point the gun at the target. The shell handled everything else. Chen estimates his kill rate improved 5-fold with proximity-fused ammunition, 5 times more effective with the same training, same guns, same crew. The difference was entirely technological. The industrial achievement behind those 150,000 proximity fuzzes fired at Okinawa represents one of the great untold stories of World War II. While the Manhattan Project gets celebrated for complexity and the Enigma code-breaking for intelligence impact, the VT Fuse program combined both elements with the additional challenge of mass production. Each fuse contained 130 electronic components that had to withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity during firing, function reliably in temperature extremes from -50 to +150 degrees Fahrenheit, and cost less than $20 to manufacture. Meeting those requirements simultaneously required innovations in miniaturization, materials science, vacuum tube design, battery technology, and manufacturing processes that wouldn't become common in civilian applications until decades later. Armstrong's research uncovers the human side of that industrial achievement. The Crosley Corporation factory in Cincinnati employed over 10,000 workers, most of them women, working 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Each worker specialized in one aspect of fuse assembly. Mary Patterson, a 32-year-old mother of 2 whose husband served in the army in Europe, spent 8 hours a day, 6 days a week installing the tiny glass vacuum tubes that made the fuse function. Her productivity was measured in units per hour, her quality control in rejection, rates that had to stay below 1%. Patterson never saw the completed fuse, never witnessed the testing, never received feedback on whether her work actually functioned in combat. She simply installed vacuum tubes into fuse bodies that came down the assembly line and moved on to the next one. Over the course of her employment at Crosley, Patterson personally worked on approximately 30,000 fuses. Somewhere in the Pacific, those fuses destroyed kamikaze aircraft and saved American lives. Patterson never knew which ones, never received recognition, never understood the full scope of what her assembly line work accomplished. Multiply Patterson's story by 10,000 workers at Crosley alone, then by the 87 other firms involved in various stages of VT fuse production, and the scale becomes staggering. Over 100,000 Americans, most of them civilians, most of them women, contributed to creating the weapon that defeated the kamikaze. Their work was classified, unrecognized, measured only in production quotas and quality metrics. But their collective effort produced 22 million proximity fuses during the war, 15 million of them allocated to the Pacific Theater specifically to counter suicide attacks. The women who installed vacuum tubes, soldered circuits, tested batteries, and assembled fuse components saved more American lives than most combat units, and did so without ever firing a shot. The strategic implications of VT fuse effectiveness shaped American planning for the invasion of Japan itself. Operation Downfall, scheduled for November 1945, anticipated that Japan would reserve its remaining aircraft, estimated at 10,000, for kamikaze defense of the home islands. Intelligence assessments predicted that defending the invasion fleet would require destroying over 5,000 kamikaze aircraft in the first week alone. With time-fused ammunition, that defensive requirement would have been impossible. 5,000 kills at 1,162 rounds per kill would require over 5,800,000 shells, more than the entire invasion fleet could carry. But with VT fuzzes reducing the requirement to 310 rounds per kill, 5,000 kills required only 1,550,000 shells, still an enormous expenditure, but achievable. The invasion could proceed because proximity fuses made the kamikaze threat manageable rather than insurmountable. American industry responded by ramping up VT fuse production to 100,000 units per day by August 1945. New variants with improved sensitivity and reliability, the Mark 53 and Mark 58 models, were entering mass production. These advanced fuses could detect aircraft at greater distances, functioned more reliably in adverse weather, and cost less to manufacture than earlier versions. By September 1945, the planned start date for Operation Olympic, the first phase of the Japan invasion, American forces would have had access to over 3 million proximity fuzzes, specifically allocated for anti-kamikaze defense. The technological advantage that proved decisive at Okinawa would have been overwhelming during the invasion. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before that climactic test occurred. But Japanese military planners, in their post-surrender testimonies, acknowledged that proximity fuses had already defeated their defensive strategy. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, testified that intelligence assessments of American anti-aircraft capabilities led to the conclusion that homeland defense kamikaze attacks would achieve less than 10% success rates. At that rate, trading 10 aircraft and pilots for one damaged American ship was strategically worthless. The kamikaze, Japan's last desperate tactical innovation, had been rendered obsolete by American electronic warfare before the bombs fell. Armstrong's final report, submitted to Admiral Turner in July 1945, quantifies the VT fuse's contribution with precision that only a mathematician could appreciate. Proximity-fused ammunition prevented the loss of an estimated 47 major warships during the Okinawa campaign. Each ship represented hundreds of millions of dollars in construction costs, years of training for its crew, and irreplaceable strategic capability. More significantly, those 47 ships that didn't sink carried crews totaling over 31,000 sailors. The VT fuse, through mathematical superiority rather than courage or tactics, saved 31,000 American lives during one campaign. Extrapolate that impact across the entire Pacific War, from the first combat use at Guadalcanal in January 1943 through Okinawa in June 1945, and the life-saving total exceeds 100,000. 100,000 American servicemen who returned home because proximity fuzzes killed enemy aircraft before those aircraft could kill them. But Armstrong's report also notes a darker reality. The VT Fuze killed effectively and indiscriminately. Every kamikaze pilot who died when a proximity-fused shell detonated near his aircraft was a young man, often barely 20 years old, who had been trained, indoctrinated, and ultimately sacrificed by a military system that offered him no alternative. The efficiency with which American technology destroyed these young Japanese men, 61% of all kamikaze launched at Okinawa, represents both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, because American sailors lived. Tragedy, because Japanese pilots died in pursuit of a strategic objective that technology had already made impossible. The proximity Fuze didn't just defeat the kamikaze tactically, it exposed the fundamental bankruptcy of suicide warfare in an age of electronic intelligence. The comparison between American and Japanese approaches to anti-aircraft defense reveals two irreconcilable philosophies about the value of human life and the role of technology in warfare. American doctrine invested billions of dollars and mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers to develop weapons that would protect sailors by killing more effectively. Japanese doctrine invested spiritual preparation and cultural indoctrination to create weapons out of the sailors themselves. One approach valued life enough to spend unlimited resources preserving it. The other approach treated life as expendable ammunition in service of strategic objectives. The VT Fuze proved that in modern warfare, the former philosophy possessed decisive advantages. Captain Harold Stevenson, commanding officer of the destroyer Aaron Ward, another ship that survived devastating kamikaze attacks during the May 3 Kikusui operation, wrote a letter to his family after the battle that captured this distinction with unusual clarity. "We fought men today who were willing to die for their cause," Stevenson wrote. "That courage commands respect even from enemies. But willingness to die is not enough when your opponent has built weapons that think faster than you can." Our shells knew when to explode. Their pilots only knew when to die. That made all the difference. The legacy of the proximity Fuze extended far beyond World War II. The principle of smart munitions, weapons containing their own targeting intelligence, became foundational to American military doctrine. Modern anti-aircraft missiles use sophisticated descendants of the original VT Fuze concept. The Aegis combat system, protecting current Navy warships, processes, targeting information, and launches missiles with proximity fuzzes in microseconds, achieving kill rates the World War II designers never imagined. The Phalanx close-in weapon system, last-ditch defense against modern anti-ship missiles, operates on principles pioneered when defending against kamikaze. The technological lineage is direct and undeniable. Every American warship today carries weapons descended from the proximity Fuze, proof that the innovation that defeated the kamikaze established paradigms still relevant 80 years later. For the Japanese kamikaze pilots who survived the war, most of them having aborted missions when their aircraft were damaged or when they witnessed the devastating effectiveness of American defensive fire, the proximity Fuze represented a harsh lesson about the limitations of spiritual power against material advantage. Yasuo Kuwahara, who trained as a kamikaze pilot but never flew a suicide mission, wrote in his memoir that the proximity Fuze destroyed not just aircraft, but the fundamental ideology that had made kamikaze attacks conceivable. The military leadership had promised that Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, would overcome American material superiority. But when shells detonated with impossible accuracy, when aircraft disintegrated miles from their targets, when entire squadrons were wiped out before reaching attack range, the promise of spiritual superiority collapsed. Technology had proven more powerful than belief. The human cost of that lesson was staggering. Approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died during the Okinawa campaign alone. Most of them achieved nothing beyond their own deaths. Their aircraft were destroyed by proximity-fused shells at ranges where they could not possibly reach targets. Their sacrifice, from a purely military perspective, was wasted. They died not because American sailors were braver or more skilled, but because American industry had built better fuses. That reality, more than any strategic defeat or territorial loss, marked the end of the kamikaze as a viable tactic. When technology defeated determination with such mathematical certainty, continuing the suicide attacks became not just militarily pointless but morally indefensible. The proximity Fuze at Okinawa demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare belonged to nations that could mobilize industrial capacity, scientific knowledge, and organizational capability to produce superior technology at scale. Individual courage, tactical innovation, and willingness to sacrifice meant nothing against weapons that could think for themselves. The mathematical superiority was absolute. 310 rounds per kill versus 1,162, 73% more effective. Enough to transform desperate defense into survivable combat. Enough to save 47 ships and 31,000 lives. Enough to defeat the divine wind with electronics, mathematics, and American industrial might. Thomas McKinley, recovering from minor wounds in a Pearl Harbor hospital while Bush is being scrapped, reads the after-action reports with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride because he and his crew fought as well as any sailors could, achieving 43 confirmed kills in a battle that should have destroyed them. Sorrow because those 43 kills were 43 young men who died believing their sacrifice would matter, only to discover in their final moments that American technology had rendered their courage obsolete. McKinley doesn't celebrate those kills. He simply acknowledges the brutal mathematics that kept him alive while they died. Mathematics made possible by proximity fuses that knew when to explode, turning near misses into certain death with electronic precision that human determination could never overcome. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.